Hello and welcome to my video series and my very first video covering how to create asteroids in GameMaker. And so our goal is to create a game that kind of looks like this. So you're able to destroy asteroids, you can fly around, and eventually, if you crash into one, your ship will explode. And so that is our goal, and we're going to work towards doing that. Now, this video series does assume that you have no experience with GameMaker, so I'm essentially going to explain everything as we do it, but it will assume that you have a slight bit of background in programming, specifically like a Computer Science 1 course, such as AP Computer Science A, or a first semester college programming course. All right. Also, and then for this project, you will need the assets. And so I will include a link to download these. So some asteroids, some backgrounds, some player ships, just so that we have some sprites to work with. So assuming that you have that downloaded and you're ready to go, let's create our project. So this is the main page of GameMaker, and let's just click on New. New game. Now, I don't really use any of the templates. I haven't explored most of those templates, so I prefer just to make a blank game. So the project name will be Asteroids, and I'm going to call it AGD for Advanced Game Design. Now, the default saving location is your Documents folder, but I do recommend changing it to somewhere a little bit easier to find. The Documents folder isn't a bad place for it. But I am going to switch mine over to the desktop, and I have a folder for GameMaker projects here. So that's where I'm going to save my project. Once I've selected all that, I'm going to click on Let's Go, and it will create the project. So we're going to be staring at this screen quite a lot, because this is where most of the development action is going to take place. This main screen right here called Workspace 1 is where, as we create new objects, this is where we're going to write the code for it or set up the settings. On the right side here is the asset browser, and this is going to list all of the graphics we've loaded into our program under sprites and all the actors that we've created under objects. The inspector will have some interesting options whenever we have something selected. So usually some more settings for like the room or for an object might appear over here. And then any sort of console messages such as errors, compile errors, or any printing out to the console we do during the game's runtime will appear down here. So let's get started with kind of the standard workflow of loading a graphic and then creating an actor or an object to use that graphic. So we're going to right click on sprites, this folder right here, and choose Create Sprite. Now, when we create the sprite, it'll give us a chance to rename it right away, and we should. So I'm going to start with the prefix SPR, and you really should have a standardized naming system. SPR is the preferred GameMaker style for naming sprites, because you can refer to all of these sprites via code. And so you want to have some kind of identifier to signify that this is a sprite. For objects, I'm going to call them OBJ. So each type of thing will have a different prefix. So I'm going to call this SPR underscore player ship. And then I'm going to push enter to change the name. And you can see that the name updated here. If you want to move around on the workspace, if you click and drag the middle mouse button, will let you pan. Control mouse wheel will let you zoom in and out. And mouse wheel just moves up and down. Side mouse does side mouse wheels. So the first thing we want to do is import our image. We could draw the image ourselves, but let's not. So under this assets, GameMaker, player, ships. Now I've included some sprites from the old DOS game Tyran. And so we can pick one of these to be the player ship. So I'm going to pick one of the Maelstrom ships. I've also included some scaled up models because I do think that the default is a little bit small. So I did include a 2x size. So I'm going to click that and hit open. it will remind me that I'm about to do something that is not able to be undone. So Control Z won't undo this. That's fine. And now we have our sprite here. If we want to zoom out, Control Mouse will let you zoom out so you can get an idea of what it looks like. And then clicking and drag middle mouse will let you pan. If you did want to resize this, you can use the resize tool over here. Although I do caution you that because these are kind of hard pixels, if you choose to resize by like non-whole pixel amounts, so like for example, if I wanted to make this 10% larger, it's not going to have a very happy time. Like it'll look fine here, but it may have a little bit of ghosting when we actually play with it inside the game. So I would advise against that. Notice I just used Control Z to undo that change I just did. And if you want to make absolutely sure you're back to the original image, you can click Import and just reload that graphic again, and it will replace the old one. So the next thing on this screen that we need to pay attention to is this little crosshair up here. This crosshair indicates what the center of this object will be. And so right now the center is in this top left, and that's not the most useful place for it because this center also serves as your point of rotation. So if my ship rotated up here, that's not going to be very useful. It's also the X and Y position of something. So it wouldn't really be very logical to consider the X and Y position of the ship to be like kind of in this little upper corner. So you can drag it and choose where you want to put it. However, most of the time, I'm going to choose middle center. Now, there are reasons to choose like bottom center or top center or other things, but for most things in this project, I'm going to pick middle center. And then lastly, the sprite controls the hitbox or the collision mask of the object. And so it defaults to just doing a rectangular hitbox. And you can see that this may not make a lot of sense for an Asteroids game because that means up here in this little upper right corner is considered to be part of your ship's hitbox, and that would not be very fair for an asteroid just to clip you up here and count as getting hit. So we can switch it to different types. So there's an ellipse, which will probably use for the asteroids. Diamond, which isn't always that useful. And then precise. Precise will work really well for the player. And what precise does is if it's a transparent pixel, it doesn't have a hitbox. It's basically matching the hitbox to the graphic. And so if the ship were to rotate, that hitbox would go with it. All right, so with all those changes, I'm pretty happy with the player sprite. And I'm going to close it. So that was the first part, making the graphic. Then the second part is to actually make the object that uses the graphic. So if you right-click on the Objects folder and go to Create Object, we can now create the player object that's associated with this graphic. So I'm going to use the prefix obj_player. You could have chose player ship. If you want to rename something, you just right-click it and go to Rename, and then you can change the name of it. Or you can just change the name up here. So we can choose the sprite right here under this sprite choice. So we just go into the sprites folder and choose SPR player ship. Now, this is just the default sprite. The sprite can be changed with code, and we will do that for some of the asteroids. We'll have it randomly pick a different sprite. The collision mask, you could actually choose a different hitbox for it. However, in this project, we're not going to change that. And then some of the options for an object. We have visible. This will just hide the object. So some things you may want to have invisible, like a level manager, something that tracks the state of the game. Solid is good for walls and things that you don't typically want to move or be able to like bump into things. Persistent allows an object to continue to exist in between levels, which would be good for like a level manager if you're tracking like variables or like the state of something in between stages. Persistent would be a good thing to check. Uses physics would switch GameMaker to using its physics engine for the object, which you would think for an asteroids project would be very beneficial. But I don't think it's very intuitive to use for like a very first project. So I'm going to avoid using the physics engine. We will look at it in a future project, but I don't really think it's a good place to start. And then manage has to do with multiplayer, which I don't have a lot of experience with. So, all right, now the fields that we care the most about will be the events field and the variable definitions field. The events field is where we're going to do all of our coding. The variable definitions field is where we get to declare essentially instance variables. So our instance variables are going to be inside of here. So let's create a couple that would be beneficial for a player ship. So the first one I can think of is turn speed. The idea is that by putting a turn speed here, if I want to adjust the speed that the player can turn at, I just have to change this variable. And this is 10, which is an odd number, but that's effectively going to be 10 degrees. And GameMaker measures time in frames, not seconds. And a game runs by default at 60 frames per second. So effectively, this is 10 degrees per frame, but then there are 60 frames per second. So we might have to play with that number. Let's put in a max speed. And this is how fast the player is allowed to travel. So no more than 12 units, which would actually end up being pixels. 12 pixels per frame will be our max speed. Then I want an acceleration variable. And this is how fast the player is going to speed up while I'm pressing down the forward key. And then I want a deacceleration variable. And this is how fast the player is going to come to a stop. How much speed do they lose each frame if they are not putting in any motion? All right, so those are the instance variables that we'll start with. We will add more, but those are good to start with. Now let's start setting up the controls. So to get to the keyboard events, if we click on Add Event, we can go down and see that there's 3 different types of keyboard event. There is key down, there's key pressed, and key up. So key down is going to activate every frame that the key is being pressed down. So if you're holding down left to turn left, this will activate every frame. That's probably what we want. Key pressed will activate only once, and will activate the frame that the key is first pressed down. And then key up is activated only once when the key is first released. These are actually really useful for like charge weapons. Like if you want to hold down the mouse to charge up a shot, and then when you release the mouse, you actually shoot off some kind of laser based on how long you charged it. But we want key down for what we're doing here. And I'm going to choose left. So now it's going to ask us, do we want to use a block-based coding, or do we want to actually type our code? We definitely want to type our code because it does give us a lot more flexibility and power. So I'm going to choose to tell it, don't ask again for this project, and then hit OK. So for this key down left event, we've got to figure out how we want to program this. And that leads us to a discussion of what a stage in GameMaker looks like. So a stage in GameMaker kind of looks like this. So the top left is 0, 0. And positive Y is actually down, which is kind of weird. Positive X is like normal. But that doesn't help us with rotation. That's just like positions. Now, as far as rotation goes, the unit circle is the same unit circle as mathematics. So right is 0 degrees, up is 90 degrees, left is 180 degrees, and down is 270 degrees. So that means if I have a ship sitting right here, and I want to be able to turn left, that looks like I would be adding degrees to my position, or to my rotation. I will say that this does kind of make cosine and sine a little bit weird, because if you were to do sine of 90 degrees, you will still get +1. And so there's a little, if you start wanting to use trigonometry for stuff, there's a little bit of thinking you might have to do, because positive y is actually down, but if you were to do sine of 90 degrees, you get a +1. So the positional y-axis is flipped from normal, but the trigonometry y values are like the unit circle. So anyway, we want to add degrees if we're turning. Now there are two variables associated with the direction of an object. The first one is the variable direction, and this governs the movement direction. So direction is, gameplay-wise, which way is this object facing? And all objects default facing to 0 degrees, which is the same direction this sprite is facing. The other one is image angle. Image angle is the direction of the sprite. So basically the sprite can be facing a different direction than the direction variable is. But I want to, in this game, kind of keep them aligned. So this is turn left, which is a positive rotation. So if I want to do turn right pretty quickly, I can just right-click this event and choose duplicate. When I choose duplicate, it'll ask me to pick a new event to trigger it from. And so I want key down right. And so I'm going to switch this to being turn right, which is a negative rotation. So with that, let's test it. To test this, we do need to put the player inside of the level. In GameMaker, the level is called a room. So let's open this room 1. And this little home icon means that this is the room that the game is going to go to when the game launches. Over here on the left, we can see the layers that the room has. Instances are where actors go. So for example, when I put the player into the world, I want to make sure that I have the instances layers selected so that I can drag and drop the player into the game world. Background refers to whatever static image we want to have as the background of this stage. And we can zoom out a little bit with Control mouse wheel. And you can also, so if we want to change the settings of the room, if we just click on room inside of the asset view, we could actually see the pixel size of the room. And right now, this is also going to be the size of the window that the game gets launched in. So the game will launch as a 1366 long pixel window by 768 pixels tall window. All right, so let's hit play and see what happens. So the game compiles. We would have gotten an error out here in the output if we had a script error. So if your game doesn't launch, make sure you read through the output to see perhaps which line caused the error. And we can see that if I hit left and right, so I'm pushing left right now, and I'm getting a correct left rotation. If I push right, I get a correct right rotation. They are a little bit fast, so I'm probably going to slow that down a little bit. So to stop this, just press the stop button and that will close the GameMaker window. Alternatively, if you just close the window here, it has the same effect as pushing stop. However, the stop button is good if your game gets stuck in an infinite loop. Like maybe when you're spawning asteroids, you fail to increment the loop counter and it gets stuck in an infinite process or something. So I do want to slow down my rotation, so I'm going to divide this turn speed by 2. And I'm doing that because I know down the road I want to use this turn speed as a mouse turn speed later. So I'm just going to divide this by 2. So effectively, every frame we rotate 5 degrees. All right, so that's rotation. Now, if you wanted to put WASD in, and I'll include an optional video about a more advanced way to do this, but you could just take these events, right-click them, duplicate them, and then choose the A key, so that so you can also use A for left. But I'll caution you that the player could both hit A and the left key and rotate twice as fast. So that's something to keep in mind, that you'll want to hang around for that optional video about how we can optimize my controls. So let's get movement forward working. So that's going to be another event when we do key down, up. So this is going to be my move forward. So to move forward, I want to say speed plus equals XL. Now, speed is a built-in variable, and every frame, the object is going to move speed units in the direction of direction. So as I increase speed, it's going to every frame apply this. So if we hit play, we can see that when I push forward, the ship is speeding up. It's never going to slow down. So it just keeps on getting faster and faster. So that's something we're going to need to fix. And also screen wrapping. So let's limit the speed. If speed is less than max speed, then speed plus equals XL. Alternatively, you could just say speed equals the minimum of speed and max speed. That is another way to approach limiting you could use that to also limit it. So the min function will choose the lower of speed and max speed. So like if we added speed, so like if we're at speed 11 and then we bump it up to 14, 14 is greater than the 12, so it's going to choose to set the minimum of 14 and 12, so it'll set speed to 12. So this is actually a better way to do it because it will guarantee we will travel at max speed. So I might just scrap the if statement here. So let's do the same for going in reverse. So let's duplicate the event and do a down key. And this will be moved backwards at half speed. So it'll be speed minus equals XL divided by 2 because I want to go in reverse slower. And then here we'd have to change the logic between choosing the maximum of speed or negative max speed. So if speed is, let's say, negative 20 and our max speed 12 and negative 12 divided by 2 is negative 6. It'll choose the larger of two, negative 6 versus negative 20. So it'll set us to this max speed. So we can play test that to make sure that this works. So as I push forward, I can no longer get any faster than this. And if I push reverse, we can see that I'm getting a slower backwards speed behavior. So the only two things that are missing are some kind of deacceleration. So if I'm not pushing forward, the ship will eventually coast to a stop. And some kind of screen wrapping. So when I leave off of one edge of the screen, I reappear on the other. So let's handle slowing down. So that's going to make use of this deaccel variable, but I'm also going to use the internal variable friction. So we want to add a new step called begin step. And begin step, we're going to we're just going to say friction equals deaccel. Hopefully I spelled that right. And so what's going to happen is begin step is processed before the keystrokes are applied. So begin step happens before input events are triggered. So the input events could overwrite this to 0, and that's what we're going to do. So normally if we don't push a forward or backwards key, my ship is going to want to deaccel down by 0.5 each frame. Just as a note, friction is applied to speed in between step and end step. Most of the input events will be triggered during step, and then end step happens after all the inputs are processed. So if we go to up and we say friction equals 0, and then we go to down and we say friction equals 0, then we're able to turn off friction, basically, the frame that we're pushing keys. So if we're pushing forward, friction isn't going to start, it's not going to start slowing us down. But the moment we're not pushing up or down, we will start to slow. So we hit run, and we can see that as I push the key, I move, but the moment I release the key, I kind of coast to a stop. Now I do it this way because if you just set friction to 0.5 and let it be, you'll end up basically having to do a little bit more complex math for your movement. Because if you just set friction to 0.5, every time you try to increase your speed, it's also going to get decreased by 0.5 every frame. So I just find it easier to turn off friction when I'm moving and then reapply friction when I'm not moving. And the very last thing that we want to do is screen wrapping. And that's going to want to happen during the end step. And so the end step, we're going to screen wrap. End step is good for things like checking cooldowns, fixing stuck collisions, obviously screen wrapping, checking hit points, and destroying the object. And so those are the main things. There might be a couple other that we'll run into, but this happens after like the entire frame of the game is finished. So we just want to screen wrap here. So what these parameters are, there's a built-in method called move wrap. And the first parameter, which is the HOR, is whether or not we wrap horizontally. Vert, which is the second parameter, is whether or not we wrap vertically. And the last parameter is by how much of a margin. So if we go 1 pixel off the screen, we will screen wrap. And so we'll use this for like the asteroids and the player for the screen wrapping. So we can hit play test this. And we can see that we've got forward, we've got screen wrapping. We can go into reverse. Now, I would encourage you to play with some of the settings, play with the numbers, see what you can do differently. Maybe you want to implement WASD. I'm going to leave it as just these controls so we don't clutter up the events. And so that's kind of our basic movement. So let me go through these just so you can pause the video if you need to get some of this code. So here's our begin step. This is where we applied our friction. End step is where we activated screen wrap. We'll do some other things here, such as updating our cooldowns, and actually all these other tasks. Turning left, simply just turning left. Turning right, which is where we do a negative rotation. Moving forward, where we increase our speed by accel, and then we just cap our speed by our max speed. And then moving backwards, where we move half of our acceleration backwards. So that's it for this video. In the next video, we're going to implement mouse controls so that we can actually experiment a little bit with using the mouse to steer the ship. And we'll learn a lot about calculating the angle between two things, which is an incredibly useful thing to use in GameMaker. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.